This is definitely one of our more studious episodes we've had, but I think
Yeah.
it's fascinating to contemplate some of these concepts. Understanding the natural disclaimer that nothing here is legal advice or anything like that, but what
It is not.
it is not, right? But what kind of practices or suggestions should landowners or mineral owners keep in mind when they're negotiating their oil and gas leases today to potentially prevent one of those issues? Welcome back to another episode of the Real Deal Landman Show. You got some kind of like dance event happening behind you.
So what's happening here?
Well, I noticed you have a new setup today, and now there's like a dance party happening.
I was gonna talk to you about that. So I'm doing the show from my in-home studio, which is like my wife calls this my Drew's light room of shame, and there's going to be a lot going on here. Like I'm packed in a little corner and we've got our Real Deal Landman set up here. And I've got like a lot of different light tubes and stuff going on. And I'm like packed in. I've got the mic over my shoulder, which is a little bit awkward. We're seeing if we can transform this space into a nice little interview room and office. So
yeah,
there may be some breakout dance sessions that happen over my shoulder here. And if you see any of them, just note that is not like a fire alarm going off. I'm not going to have to evacuate. I will get situation under control. Everything will be rectified very quickly.
I would have never thought it was the fire department, but the police was high. Like that was top of mind.
Was high on the list.
You just got back off of a vacation to MLB Spring Training.
I did.
Did you make any teams?
Let me tell you. So I'm sure a lot of people that listen like are much bigger baseball fans than I am. I got to play, Little League all through high school and everything. Didn't ever play in college, but baseball was such a big part of my life and I absolutely loved it. Always wanted to go to spring training, but never pulled the trigger on it. My wife and her family, we all decided a long time ago, this is something that we wanted to hit. They had hit it before and I had not. And I got to tell you, it was so fun. It's all around the Phoenix area. I don't want to get it wrong, but I think there's 8 or 9 stadiums there, all representing different major league teams. The fan bases of every one of those different teams travels incredibly well, well beyond what you would expect. And so you can kind of pick your poison and you can find, if you are like my wife's family is from the upper, like Pacific Northwest. And so they're big Seattle Mariners fans. Okay. And so you can follow the Mariners team at their little home stadium there in Peoria, or called Peoria Stadium. And then the next day you could follow them over to maybe the Brewers Stadium, which is what we did. And then the day after that, we went over and we saw them at the Chicago Cubs Stadium. And so you get to see different teams. You get to see it really is kind of the see the stars of tomorrow. And you see like 1 or 2 players that are on like the main roster and then everybody else that's like super hungry to be able to get on the team. The wildest thing for me, though, is like, again, and I think all of us could say this of, as you get older and you start seeing all of the things like, whenever I was in little leagues, I would look up to these major league players and I was like, holy cow, like huge beehive beards. And like, these guys are just grizzled and everything. And now I'm sitting in the stands and they're like, coming to the plate, number 14, Davey, Smith. He was born in 2003. And I was like, oh man, he's a child. But it was so fun. Like I've been a Cubs fan my whole life, and so to be able to see the Cubs there was really legit. It was super cool. And if you haven't ever been to the Phoenix area, you need to go. It's gorgeous. Like we went to the botanical gardens and we got to see all the cactus and like did some hikes, and it was just a lot of fun. So good time to be able to get out and about right after battling an upper respiratory infection. So, I highly suggest that for anybody that's recovering.
Trip or the respiratory infection?
Not both. I mean, why not, right?
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
No.
Drew, I think today is another first today. I don't believe we have ever recorded across 3 time zones at once.
That's pretty big.
Doing that, yeah. So we've got coverage from Mountain, Central, and Eastern. Joining us from Pittsburgh is Brendan O'Donnell. I'm really excited to dive into this topic today that we're going to talk about with Brendan. But Brendan, how are you doing today?
Doing all right. I have my own respiratory infection, so all I got to do is go to Phoenix.
Nice. Yeah, you go to Phoenix; it'll clear right up. I swear.
That's it. Said I'm here.
Well, thank you. Despite the health difficulties, thank you for joining us today. tell us a little bit about yourself. We know you're in Phoenix. What else? Or not Phoenix, Pittsburgh. What else should people know?
I'm an attorney at Houston Harbaugh, a mid-sized firm in Pittsburgh. We serve Pennsylvania. Firm has clients in West Virginia, Ohio. My practice focuses on representing oil and gas owners. So, most of the firms of any size in town represent industry. We represent landowners. I've always represented landowners. And so it's a bit of a unique niche. Makes for an interesting elevator pitch when you talk to folks around town, though. I have very few clients in Pittsburgh proper. Usually it's adjoining counties. And so I've been here, what year is it? COVID was about 10 years there,
Yeah.
2016, about 9 years, I think. And before that, I had worked at a smaller firm in Washington County, Pennsylvania, when that was the boom place for everybody in the oil and gas industry to be. I had the full treatment of all the different landmen on laptops sitting in the lobby of the building, trying to time into the recorder of deeds office when their server could only handle so many requests. And that's what I did coming out of law school. Just got into it. Firm represented landowners, and I've been doing it ever since.
So tell me what year you were getting out of law school.
2010.
2010.
So there were not a lot of jobs getting out in 2010. So it was, hey, I want a job. And it just so happened that the firm focused on representing property owners in the backyard, negotiating oil and gas leases, and it's worked for me since. So it's one of those things in life. You don't really choose what you do. Life has a way of dictating it for you. And here I am these years later, still doing the same thing.
What would you say are some of the interesting events that you've represented landowners on that people might not normally think of? I mean, yeah, people think of like negotiating oil and gas leases, but are there other aspects that you've represented property owners on that are maybe outside the norm?
The big one in Pennsylvania is title. I think Pennsylvania and Hawaii are about the only two states where they're adding new land every single day. Hawaii gets it in volcanoes. Pennsylvania, we get it because the old survey wasn't entirely accurate.
Interesting.
So if you have the old survey from 1885, the property was from this rock to the dead oak tree to the old beach to some point in the middle of a road, and everything's gone and the road moved. Where is the property? Who owns the oil and gas in it? That's a big, big issue, and it'll continue to be a big, big issue. Because, one of the things about Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio as well, there was a lot of oil and gas law from here in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then it just disappeared for pretty much the entire 20th century. Texas picked it up. And then we wound up with the Marcellus boom up here, where there was like a century of law that was largely missing. And then it's about, how do you bootstrap it together? What state do you look at? So all of those points I think are fairly interesting in a background, where it's a lot of piecing things together versus, a one track, hey, this is how this issue's been treated here for 100 years. There's a million court decisions on it. It makes for a different environment here in Pennsylvania versus some other jurisdictions, to the south and west.
Yeah, I lived and worked that like while that was happening. I got to see that transpire. I mean, it's been almost 20 years now, but I was working for a company that bought a bunch of Appalachian assets through West Virginia and Pennsylvania, and it included this massive lease play that was going to be in the heart of the Marcellus. At that time, that acreage was described in warrants, which was something that nobody had ever heard of before. Not even the tax assessor of the county where it was. They didn't, like, I tried to ask for a warrant map and they looked at me like I was from the moon. But it was a fascinating situation, like you said, because late 1800s, that's where the activity was. And then when the Marcellus was happening, I mean, I attended a lot of different industry events and kind of conferences and like small group meeting committee type stuff, trying to figure out how do we operate, not only like operating in a realm that hasn't seen massive activity to that scale and that capital expenditure, but also a horizontal world that everybody was dealing with at the same time. It was a really fascinating kind of case study that was happening, because you would think the oldest producing area of the country would be far ahead, but in terms of law and litigation and regulatory principles, I mean, just like you said, they had been offline for about 100 years and were rapidly trying to catch up. It was interesting stuff.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that's somewhat awkward. I mean, if you generally think about Pennsylvania and the Northeast compared to, Texas, the view is, at least my view is generally, do whatever you want to do in Texas because it's Texas. I mean, it's not those old, northeastern states with all the regulatory red tape. But in the oil and gas world, there's the amount of regulation, in Texas with the Railroad Commission is far, 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 far greater than anything you'd ever encounter in Pennsylvania, where a lot of those regulations can, help to fill in the gaps of some concepts. But in Pennsylvania, just doesn't exist. It's probably about one of the only things Pennsylvania doesn't have regulations on. So it's a bit awkward to say, well, yeah, in this realm, Texas has a lot more regulation than Pennsylvania, particularly when you deal with energy, which is, the big Texas thing. So it makes for an interesting dynamic where there's not as many gap fillers here on concepts as there are in other states.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, Jairus, what cities were you in whenever you were there?
So I had a part-time office in Pittsburgh. I was on the north side in Cranberry, and then from that office, I would go up to the Northeast into Pennsylvania and to where a lot of the early activity was happening. And then I'd also go down south into West Virginia, where we acquired a lot of legacy assets, and we were exploring potential new spots to drill horizontally for the Marcellus.
The only place, and I mean, you guys tell me, where am I thinking of? Whenever I was with Chesapeake, I had to go up to Towanda, Elmira, and was it Horseheads? Is that another place that's right in the middle up there? And is that in the east, the northeast?
Elmira, Horseheads, New York.
Okay, so it's right on the border there.
Towanda's Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So that's the northern tier of Pennsylvania, southern tier of New York. So north and east of here, north and east of State College. But yeah, those areas up there are historically, in the Marcellus, big areas. Yeah. In any one of those counties, that's where you get the warrants because, I mean, they still are very lightly populated. Hundreds of years ago, when they were trying to get people to settle, they just drew maps and put warrants on them and gave them to people just to settle the land. So it is an interesting dynamic when you deal with warrants and then you deal with other surveys that are weird, and now, tax mapping overlaid on everything, but the tax mapping is only the surface. So mineral tracts don't have parcel maps. So a mineral tract is not necessarily the same thing as a surface tract. Yeah, that's where the title issue becomes difficult. And also because generally speaking, the property sizes are smaller here than, say, West Texas. So there's a lot of 31 acre, 85 acre properties versus a 2,500 acre rectangle.
Yeah.
During some of that early leasing that was taking place, that was also where we saw some of those larger landowner groups or those coalitions that got together to negotiate big deals. Did you work on any of those?
Tangentially, I was aware of them. There were a lot of them that existed. Some of them I think were better than others in terms of leveraging size to get a better lease. Sometimes people would get picked off. That's really not a thing anymore. It was probably 2010 to about 2014-ish, I think, is probably the heyday of the big landowner groups. I don't know how many properties actually got developed under them either, because that was another thing too. There was a lot of leases that were signed in the leasing boom. I think it caused some companies to no longer be with us when they just acquired lots of assets they could never develop. And then later on, it was, can we actually develop under this lease?
Yeah.
Which caused a lot of amendments to leases to say, turns out we can't actually do anything with these terms. We have to do something else with them, which winds up being a protracted battle.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of the things that I think a lot of those early operators didn't realize or forgot about was, one, the terrain is not like Oklahoma and Texas. And two, this was a gas play. And so your nearest like pipeline could be 10 to 15 miles away. And you're talking about, rather rough terrain on how do you build out a gas infrastructure to be able to capture that. I mean, a lot of those problems eventually were solved and were taken care of, but some of those early days when they were out there chasing leases on a 2 or 3 year term, maybe an extension, that still was not enough time to solve some of those early critical problems that existed.
Correct. And when you deal with irregularly shaped properties, valleys, the top of a hill, the massive costs associated with developing a pad, literally clearing off the top of the hill, getting an access road up there. But then you still might have to deal with a couple dozen property owners on whatever pipeline route that you want to take. In that there's a lot of investment to deal with folks when you have properties like here versus say in other jurisdictions where there's just larger land holdings and you might be able to talk to two people and get all the rights that you need in order to develop, get the gas out, etc. It's just different here. And I do think that there was a learning curve that was experienced that Pennsylvania is just different. And a lot of people learned the hard way, but a lot of people also made a lot of money with it.
Yeah. All right, Drew, I'm going to tell you a story. This happened within the last couple of months, but I do a lot of I like to learn stuff. And so I'll take deep dives into things. And one of the things I've been reading about a lot lately is data centers and understanding like the massive scale of data centers, the investments that are going to go into it. What is all this going to require, et cetera. And through this process, while I was preparing a presentation that I delivered for NADOA a couple months ago, but as I was doing this research, I had several bots that were going out and gathering information for me. And it was interesting because these bots would gather this information and then they were trying to come up with like an outline or some talking points about how data centers were going to impact oil and gas, et cetera. And there was a phrase that they kept coming back to, and they were talking about the colocation loophole. And I, like in my mind, I think I know what that is, but I'm not really sure. And so I started kind of trying to figure out what the co-location loophole was. And they were describing a concept that I don't know if it would come into fruition or not, but it was definitely fascinating. And I was trying to find the source as to why were they coming up with this. And some of it was just kind of like their general intuition of connecting dots and coming up with it. But there were also citing a source of an article that had been written by Brendan.
Interesting.
Yes, called the co-location loophole. And so I went and found his article and I read it, and it's fascinating stuff. And that's why I wanted to bring him on today, is to be able to talk about this concept, because as we have this data center infrastructure being built out, there's these complications of the grid can't support, like the existing grid can't support the demand that is there. And so increasingly data centers are looking towards oil and gas operations to be located near them to potentially use gas or other sources to fuel generators on site to power electricity for these data centers. But in doing so brings up a lot of questions. And that's what Brendan has written about. Brendan, tell us what is one, how did you come up with this idea to write this? And two, explain to us what the co-location loophole potentially is.
I guess before I get into that, I'll just, now that you said it that way, let you know how unnerving it is when all of the arrows on the internet point to one person. One person is huge.
Flattering, isn't it? Wow.
Yeah, flattering.
Yeah.
I don't know how good thing I have my blind shut here. So the concept just came from, I would say, generally brainstorming, thinking of issues, thinking about, reading articles, thinking about a spin, thinking about things from a landowner perspective, thinking about issues or raising questions, trying to put something out there in the public dialogue. And so what hit me was, I would say, kind of a combination of a couple things that have always, say, piqued my interest from a landowner perspective, which is the royalty clause and what exactly the royalty clause requires that an operator pay, either using the explicit language or terms of art, custom and usage in the industry, whatever gap fillers may be inserted in there when the language isn't otherwise clear. And then there's the geographic concept of locating other, we'll call it industrial or other uses, either on a well pad or on the same leasehold as a well site. And what if it's a self-contained environment? What happens there? Because there are properties in Pennsylvania that wells were drilled a decade ago that still don't have a pipeline connection. There's properties in Pennsylvania where either portable LNG facilities have been brought in just to get something to market, or small scale generation for, say, crypto, you know, mining.
Yeah.
Just taking small amounts of gas and try to generate some value for it. So you wind up with those concepts and you say, there's a lot of leases out there that contemplate royalties being based on gas sold off the premises or marketed and used off the premises. Everything being directionally off the leasehold itself. And then the other thing that was the last point in the triangle or octagon, whatever it may be, of points that I was thinking about is our minimum royalty act here in Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
which sets a minimum royalty of 1/8 of the oil and gas removed or recovered from the property. And over a decade ago, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court looked at it in the Kilmer versus Alexco case. And it was based on lease language of a particular lease that provided for netback royalties. And the court said, yes, that's okay. That satisfies the minimum royalty act. And from my interpretation of it, it was more or less the point of compliance with the minimum royalty act was determined where the gas was removed or recovered, which was at the wellhead, the literal wellhead. And so then you say, well, all right, well, if compliance with a minimum royalty statute is measured at the wellhead or determined at the wellhead, but you have royalty language that contemplates the royalty being based on what is sold off the premises, how does that square? And then you
Mm-hmm.
add in the concept of what if they're consuming all of the gas, either selling it to someone on premises or the operator or an affiliate consuming it on premises where it never actually leaves. How does that actually fit into the royalty obligation? Because by the black and white of the contract, there was nothing sold or used off the premises. It was all used there. And so the idea was to try to explore those concepts, to put something there into the internet to have bots find and then track me down. Because I think it's one of those issues that lurks in the background. It may never pop up, but as you look at AI and the computing power that's needed and data centers generally, but also smaller scale data centers, and just the amount of power needed, a lot of people say that, let's go with nuclear, but great. How long does it take to build a nuclear power plant?
Right.
So a lot of it is comes to gas. And so that was the long way around of what was in my head as I was trying to reflect on these issues from a landowner perspective and point out what might be an interesting academic exercise or something that pops up into reality.
Do you see this as something that could be potentially litigated at some point?
I think it can, because there's a variety of concepts that are interplayed in there. Really the basic, what is the royalty? Is
Mm-hmm.
it truly based on what is produced and sold off the property? Or is it what actually comes out of the ground? Because that itself implicates lost and unaccounted for gas, perhaps gas that the operator is using, and then how do you distinguish that? We use this gas for some operational purpose. It just so happened that the operational purpose was running a data center. So your royalty doesn't apply to that volume. That to me is kind of the overarching question, and the co-location issue, whether it's a data center, whether it's a crypto mining facility, gets to the heart of what is the volume that the royalty is nominally can be taken in kind for oil. So like, what is the volume of stuff that I'm giving you? And is there any kind of credit or use before the operator gives it to me that I just don't get? And can that be for a commercial purpose of something other than oil and gas operations, oil and gas development entirely? Because the value proposition becomes a lot different. If you can drill a variety of wells, shale gas wells, and have a significant amount of gas, doesn't have to go very far to be able to power at least backup generators or some part of your industrial operation, whether it's a data center, a steel mill, a manufacturing facility, or otherwise. What if it just never leaves the property? What
Hmm.
if there's no gathering agreement? It just is self-contained.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
another piece that I saw kind of in that in extrapolation of that thought process was, let's say you are going to try and pay some type of royalty back to the owner for usage of that gas. What do you base the value on? Like, is it a market value of the area? Is it Henry Hub pricing? I mean, even that becomes an arguable point on what are you going to base that royalty on to actually give to those people if you feel like something is due.
Correct. And that becomes a contractual issue where if your lease contract doesn't contemplate that kind of scenario where the gas is used on site and some royalty or some payment is made, if the lease says the royalty is 15% of the amount realized by the lessee for all gas marketed and used off the premises. Okay, that provides you an identification of the royalty obligation. But then you say, well, this wasn't marketed and used off the premises. And so I didn't realize an amount of money from this. And so now I kind of have to put some synthetic layers on what I'm going to give you. Because on one hand, it just doesn't seem right
Hmm.
that hydrocarbons are being produced, they're actively consumed in a revenue generating enterprise
Right.
with no money for the use going to the royalty. You say reflexively, that just doesn't seem right. But when you try to fix it, you almost wind up in this problem of, well, now what do I do? Because I have to invent some completely different mechanism to pay something that was never agreed to in the lease contract to begin with, which then takes you full circle to, are we even allowed to do this in the first place?
Yeah.
If the idea is it doesn't seem right that you can use all of the gas produced from wells, never sell off the property, never owe a dime, then that kind of renders your royalty clause superfluous. And so you wind up with a lot of fingers pointing at each other. And I don't know that there's a clear answer other than the age old oil and gas question. You have a contract that will remain in effect for a century or more. And the industry changes, technology changes, uses change. And how do you insulate or how do you address that future in a contract where it's really hard to open the contract and say,
Yeah.
hey, the world is different now than it was back then. We have to contemplate all these different kinds of things and draft them in. It's really hard to do that because both sides have to agree.
Has that happened? Like, have you ever seen that happen on any of those leases? Or do you think that it can happen in the next few years? Do you think there's any possibility with it? Because things have changed so drastically?
I think that there's a potential.
Okay.
And I think the potential comes, and this is perhaps part of my general pet project with the Guaranteed Minimum Royalty Act in Pennsylvania, where if compliance with the Minimum Royalty Act is determined when gas is removed or recovered at the physical wellhead, then in order to satisfy the Minimum Royalty Act, a royalty in a lease has to apply to everything that was removed or recovered. So whether it's consumed on site or it's consumed off premises really doesn't matter for royalty compliance in that view. But the problem becomes that there are so many leases that
Yeah.
don't specify, look, your royalty is based on absolutely everything that comes out of the ground. I don't know that I've ever seen one. They're all premised on what goes to market, what is sold, et cetera. And so in my view, I think that there needs to be a further analysis of what exactly the concept of a royalty is. In the Pennsylvania context, what does the statute require? And then, you know, a way to determine, does the existing language of a contract deal with this? I don't think that a legislative solution is the way to do it.
Hmm.
In Pennsylvania, there's two big legislative acts that happened during the shale boom. One was in the earlier days where there were lots of leases then, just like there are now from the 1800s. Horizontal drilling was not anything that
Yep.
anyone knew about.
Right. Yeah.
Pooling unitization wasn't anything that anyone knew about. So leases didn't contemplate it at all. And so in the early days of the shale boom, operators would go find the 1887 lease and get an amendment and ratification, maybe bump the royalty up a couple points, a signing bonus. But specifically allow for unitization. And then the General Assembly here, the law was passed that more or less said if it's, if pooling and unitization aren't expressly prohibited in a lease, it's allowed. You say, well, how would anybody be able to expressly prohibit something that they didn't even know existed? And so it creates issues there. And then in more recent terms, cross-unit drilling, a horizontal lateral crosses a couple of units. The same kind of concept came up. A lot of leases contemplated unitization, but spoke about unit wells, but didn't have any contemplation of an allocation factor of, well, this perforated area of the bore that's actually producing, and how do I get paid from that? So again, the General Assembly here passed a law that said, well, if cross-unit drilling is not expressly prohibited in a lease, it's allowed, and here's how you can allocate. And so that creates problems when you have a contract where you say nickel and dime small parts, but don't see that there's a whole variety of things that actually work together in a lease. How does the term of the lease work? If gas is not actually being produced and sold off the property, is it treated like house gas? House gas isn't in Pennsylvania traditionally viewed as paying quantity. So if you're using everything in a data center and you're not actually selling anything to a marketplace, is that the same as, well, it's just your well in the backyard that's providing a little something for your stove and your furnace, and that's it. So I don't have the answers, but I think that this kind of concept, because of the interplay between a whole variety of terms in a lease, where you just can't take one thing and focus on that and say it doesn't have any ramifications to another provision. I think it's something where landowners and operators, there probably is a need to sit down and say, okay, this is what's happening. Because my sense is if you have a situation like this, there's a property, someone owns the oil and gas, someone owns the surface, which is very usual here. Surface owner, leases to whatever company wants to build a data center there. They have an agreement with the operator, and wells are drilled. Gas from those wells is used on premises, and the royalty owner says, well, where's my money? My sense is if you go to court as the royalty owner, you're at least going to have some kind of sympathetic voice and a judge who's going to say, this just doesn't seem right.
That's right.
And that, I think, is a situation where when you just deal with that kind of basic, this doesn't smell right, it can lead towards some productive discussions of, all right, how do we deal with this kind of thing? Kind of similar to the discussions that had popped up years ago of, if do you have to pay a royalty in US dollars, or can you pay it in Bitcoin? Because a lot of leases don't say, pay it in US dollars.
You're right.
And so you say, well, we just ran a crypto mining operation. Here's your money in crypto. That was an issue that popped up and I think fizzled out a couple of years ago, but it doesn't mean it can't come up. And so when you have these technological advances and advances with the use of oil and gas, which is what we all want, it just takes you into places that are different than the old, we'll drill a well, we'll connect it to a pipeline, and we'll call it a day.
That is
Understanding. Yeah, it is.
That
It's
really
fascinating
is.
stuff. This is definitely one of our more studious episodes we've had, but I think it's fascinating to contemplate some of these concepts. Understanding, the natural disclaimer that nothing here is legal advice or anything like that. But what
it is not.
It is not, right? But are there what kind of practices or suggestions should landowners or mineral owners keep in mind when they're negotiating their oil and gas leases today to potentially prevent one of those issues?
I think on this kind of concept, it requires, say, pursuing language, at least off the bat in an addendum, trying to make the royalty as expansive as possible in terms of the hydrocarbons that it applies to, but perhaps in the same time, narrowing it down, because as you wind up with lithium or other precious metals that may come out of the produced water, you may or may not want those to be as part of the same lease. You wind up with pore space and carbon capture issues and who owns the pore space, and is that allowed in the lease? So you wind up with this dichotomy where you say, well, I want the lease to be as narrowly restricted as possible to just produce oil and gas. But at the same time, the royalty or the term, the other provisions, you want to say, well, I want my gas to get to market. I want to be paid on that. But also, you don't know that you might not get a better deal on a captive high demand operation who may be willing to pay a premium. The operator may be willing to sell it because if you don't have to pay a gathering fee, you don't have to pay a transportation fee, it might actually be a better deal to sell it there. So you wind up with those kinds of issues popping up that I think are worthwhile to think about. Whether a deal ultimately is reached on those terms, I don't know. But I think that there is an expansion of what could the uses be? And let's try to put it on the table to talk through these issues. I don't want to get shortchanged, but I also don't want to restrict you, the operator, your ability to produce gas and generate revenue from selling it. So I think that there's a middle ground, but I think it does have to be an expansion beyond the historic verbiage that's been in leases for decades, and the concept, well, whatever goes to market. Well, what's the market and where is it?
That's super interesting. Like this, honestly, this has been a really good episode of diving into some really deep discussion points. And I mean, I've learned a lot with it. It makes me want to really do some research on these, especially the data centers and the different ways. Like Brendan, whenever you said people potentially paying in Bitcoin or crypto, like, I mean, I never even thought about that, but because there's no real, explicit way of, hey, this is how we're going to pay you. Like, I mean, all those things are on the table. That's super fascinating.
It's a brave new world.
It is. It really is.
Yeah. Well, Brendan, we definitely appreciate your time today. You know what? My goal was to talk a little bit about the colocation loophole, but all the other points that you brought up and given us some history and additional context about what's happening in the East has been fascinating. It's been well worth the time. So definitely thank you for sharing your insights and knowledge with you. Definitely not legal advice. You were sharing.
We will say that again.
Yes.
That's right.
Definitely
just pleasantries here. No legal advice at all.
That is correct. Yeah. For folks who may want to learn more about this or might want to get in touch with you or understand more of the services that your firm offers, how do they get in touch with you?
I guess they can have your bots go and find me on the internet where all the arrows point to me. If you don't want to do that, my firm is Houston, like the city in Texas, but not for the city in Texas. Harbaugh, hh-law.com. Go on there, professionals. You'll find me there. The oil and gas page, you'll find me there. We have our firm blog, which is where the co-location loophole started. The oil and gas addendum, where we write about new developments in oil and gas law, decisions in jurisdictions, and then general questions. A lot of landowners find me just Googling oil and gas owner, legal representation, royalty owner, lawyer, Pennsylvania. I pop up. So as long as the SEO keeps going, that's a good way to find me.
That's fantastic. Well, yeah, we really appreciate it, Brendan. Check Brendan out. You can also find him, I'm sure, on LinkedIn as well.
I'm there.
Find Brendan on LinkedIn. I mean, there's a lot of questions that probably will come up after this episode. Make sure to reach out to him or reach out to us, and we'll make sure that we can get a hold of him. But yeah, we really appreciate you coming on.
That was a great time. I appreciate you having me.
All right. So for Jarris Johnson, for Brendan O'Donnell, I'm Drew Hopkins. This is the Real Deal Landman Show. We'll see you next time.
See ya.